Will the world turn greener after COVID-19? I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Dierk Paskert and Dr. Cara Augustenborg. Dierk is CEO at Encavis, a German-listed 1.5 billion market cap company, one of Europe's largest renewable companies with operations in 10 countries and capacity totaling more than 2.5 gigawatts. They have 190 solar parks, 83 wind farms, and is Germany's largest independent listed operator of solar parks. Dr. Cara Augustenborg is a member of the Council of State at the Office of the President of Ireland. Cara is an environmental policy fellow at University College Dublin and is chairperson of the Executive Committee of Friends, or was chairperson, I should say, of the Executive Committee of Friends of the Earth Europe between 2017 and 2019. So I'd like to start with you, Cara. On our last think tank call, Professor Luke O'Neill said that we'd ignored the threat of a pandemic at our peril. And he mentioned the environment in the same light as being another significant threat. We're all experiencing cleaner air at the moment, brighter skies, less traffic. We see footage of fish returning to the river. Has coronavirus fired a warning shot? And as public health has moved to the fore, would it also push the green agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks for hosting this. I think that it's certainly, the coronavirus has given us a little sneak preview of what a climate shock might look like if we had a number of catastrophic climate events, the kind of things that the IPCC has forecasted might happen in a 2-degree world or higher. And I think this is an example of what might happen. You can see how our supply chains are so global now, how perhaps if we had shorter supply chains, we might be more resilient to these kind of shocks. And certainly, you know, there's some talk that the coronavirus came from something like a pangolin or a bat, and that room for nature, that space between humanity and nature, obviously has been shrinking all the time as part of the biodiversity crisis. So there's a lot of similarities. Whether or not we will learn from this and whether or not we will link sustainability to a post-COVID recovery, I think remains to be seen. But it's certainly giving us a lot of room for discussion on the kind of things we may need to do to try and address climate change and reduce emissions too.
Okay, thank you. And Dierk, as someone who's running a pan-European renewable company, a very successful high-growth company, what are your views in this regard?
Actually, what we see is just a snapshot currently. First of all, hi everybody, also from Germany. Sun is currently shining not as it did in the last days, so therefore we can't complain, and COVID currently doesn't have a too big effect on our business. Probably we are a rare example in the markets today. However, I fully agree with Cara, so there is it shows the current crisis shows what is possible, how we can be affected by things which we haven't thought about weeks or months before. But at the same time, if we take it from a more positive view, what is actually achievable if we are forced to do things. And so therefore, that's a positive part. Unfortunately, COVID is the more negative part of it. So it shows again that people are really only able to move once they are really forced to. So that's how I look at it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you think that the economic agenda and the green agenda can sit together? I mean, clearly, you know, we're in a situation now where economies have been shot to shreds. There's a significant threat out there. And yet you look at oil prices have collapsed. Are people going to simply default to using lower oil prices, consuming carbon again, just to get up and running?
Yeah, but if you just look at the, let's say, supply balance in Germany for April, with around Easter, so we had a record high production of solar and wind. The first time over 50% of the production was really coming from solar and wind. So therefore, that is really it shows the potential of the renewables. At the same time, this came also with a lower demand due to shutdown of industry. So therefore, it's not the normal situation yet. But again, it shows where the potential is. So therefore, and looking forward, I think COVID could actually lead to an even greener world in the future, because we see that digitalization, or at least we see the potential of digitalization. We are all staying home. We are now sitting together, everybody probably home. We are, let's say, connected to our computers. Our computers are connected to the world, and this is powered by energy coming from renewables. And this is a mandate which most corporates have set themselves over the next 10 years, coming to 100% supply by renewables. At least the bigger tech companies did this, and I think this will be a common theme, let's say, across the entire supply chain. So therefore, I think that we will even see a bigger demand for green energy once we are beyond COVID. Okay,
interesting. So yeah, so these are the likes of Amazon with their data centers, etc. Am I right?
Yeah. That's that is only one example. But you could also go to the mobility sector. I mean, we all have experienced more deliveries to our home and so on. So therefore, and we see more and more e-vehicles in the fleets. So therefore, I think there's perfect examples how the world could look like if we really want to.
Okay, thank you, Dierk. Cara, do you have anything to add to that, please?
Yeah, I would agree with what Dierk is saying, but journalists that I follow, a lot of climate journalists named David Roberts, who writes for Vox.com, at the beginning of all of this, wrote a really comprehensive article showing how the Green Deal that a lot of politicians were advocating for in the US and also in Europe, this idea of a Green New Deal, pre-pandemic, actually is a good roadmap for an economic recovery post COVID-19, and that a lot of the, a lot of the proposals for Green New Deal was about creating new infrastructure and creating new jobs, and in some places like where I live in Ireland, a lot of the climate actions that are needed would happen in rural areas. Things like afforestation and bioenergy and stuff would all be happening in rural areas which have struggled historically with employment. So there is a possibility that we can look toward the Green New Deal as a way of building an economic recovery from this in a way that's also sustainable.
Yeah. However, I think what we have to remind ourselves that, I mean, the logic is not just there since COVID. I mean, you could also say, from a negative perspective, that COVID is dominating everything, and that people and politicians are forgetting about the Green Deal. Yes, there is a Green Deal from the European Commission being announced. What that exactly means is still very vague. But other than that, there is not a lot of action which we can see currently in the market, because everything is dominated by COVID-19. And if we remember ourselves to the Paris Treaty a couple of years ago, where we set ourselves at least some ambitious targets, most of the actions being taken should, let's say, are really around 2020, and you see very little progress on that agenda. So therefore, I would rather say I'm more pessimistic that that COVID is hiding a lot of the things which should be on the agenda. So that definitely has to be put again up on the agenda this year, and not in 3-4 years once we have hopefully then past Corona.
And a question to both of you: do you think that now that people have first-hand experience, as I began to call it, cleaner air, they're more used to now sort of moving from offline to online, working from home? do you think it might be easier in some way to get more buy-in from people, as we emerge from this pandemic?
Yeah, could be because we realize what is possible. Yeah, I mean, if you would have asked people before, can you run your company from home? Probably the 10-20% would have said, okay, yeah, we might give it a try. But probably the vast majority would have said, no way, yes, for a couple of days, but not for months or quarters. That wouldn't be possible. Today, we are experiencing, yes, if we are forced to, it's somehow possible. So therefore, I think that is the positive message to the people. So that, yes, we can do much more than we can think of if we are forced to. And let's get out of the, let's say, our conventional thinking, yeah, and this is more a paradigm shift, which is realistic now, yeah? And people have evidence of that, and I think that can move them also to be more progressive also on the green agenda.
Cara, you've got first-hand experience, obviously, through University College Dublin, migrating to offline.
Yeah, and I would normally play the optimist. I tend to be a glass half full kind of person. And I will say that in the academic context, I mean, we were all given a week to completely redesign our university curriculums and put them online with no resources but whatever we had in our homes. And we've done it effectively, and it has given us pause for thought. However, I think we can't overestimate the power of the individual in solving the climate crisis, and our transport emissions in terms of commuting to and from work are relatively small relative to the other emission sectors. So as long as our energy systems are largely dominated by fossil fuel, working from home is still being driven by fossil fuels and powering all of this technology. So I think there's still the need for big system changes that need political will to implement. And the big concern I have right now, because I saw this in the last economic recession, was that environmentalism was very in. Everyone wanted to know what they could do in their homes to be more green, as long as they had a lot of money. And then as soon as we had an economic recession, environmentalism and sustainability just got completely wiped off the map. Nobody wanted to hear about it. It was all about how do we grow GDP as fast as possible. And here in Ireland, emissions, particularly in the transport sector, went spiraling up again. So I think unless we have the kind of bottom-up political pressure to keep sustainability on the agenda as we come out of this, it's very likely that we go back to that. So it's about the pressure coming from the people who promote that sustainability agenda, acknowledging that right now the pressure from dirty industries for bailout money and for relaxing environmental regulation to help them recover economically is at the forefront of their agenda too.
Yeah, and I think in order really to get there, we have to make sure that the interventions taken by politicians in all European countries over the last weeks and months is not the new role model. I mean, politicians have to step back, and the economy has to be run by free market participants. And politicians have to set the framework and the regulations for it, so that's needed, but they can't run the economy. And I'm not, at least here from a German perspective, sometimes you think if you listen then to late evening discussions on TV and so on, that politicians are sometimes now really enthusiastic about running the economy and have all good ideas for the economy. And I think that's definitely the wrong way. So yes, in the extreme times of COVID-19, probably it was necessary that everybody stays home and so on and so forth. But now when we are entering other phases, I think politicians have to step back again and really give the right framework, but abstain of really intervening directly into the markets. And that is also needed for the Green Deal.
Just wondering, you mentioned bailout money, politicians. I mean, Have you had any discussions around green bonds, or is that something that people are increasingly talking about now as a bailout sort of mechanism?
To be honest, we experience just the opposite. If we wanted to place money currently in the market, or just want to get money from the conventional markets, financing markets, they are more or less, there's a drought because everybody is concentrating on saving companies which are in real trouble, and the banks do get the full margin backed by states on these deals, and there is very little up to no money for those companies who are healthy and are really want to grow like we do. So therefore, that is really something which is worrying us currently. Hopefully, this is only a snapshot in the market and doesn't sustain too long. But it looks currently like the banks are really concentrating just on saving, let's say, companies in trouble, and not concentrating on companies who have growth ambitions and are completely healthy, like we are. Again, that doesn't help the Green Deal. I mean, our investments ahead of us, we try to double or want to double our capacities by 100% until 2025. So they're quite ambitious growth target, but we need financing for that. And that can't come just from our shareholders' equity. I mean, we need also the credit markets in order to finance that. And it looks like the credit markets are completely shut down currently.
That's very interesting. Yeah, and even for a good credit such as yourselves, you're fine. Yeah.
Yeah, because the banks are incentivized, at least here from a German perspective. All the credits they give to these companies are backed by the German state. So 100%, you get the full margin for these kind of easy money. Yeah, so it's really easy deals they can close there. And why should they then concentrate on let's say hard negotiations with us on margins for credits if they can earn the money elsewhere much easier? And that is currently the case here in Germany. So that is really worrying us.
Okay, yeah, that is that. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That's incredible to hear. And Cara, do you think that we should see more government intervention on that front? That bailouts should come. I think you were mentioning come attached with various conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see this a lot, in particularly in sectors like aviation, who have said that they might be bankrupt by May if we continue with this lack of air traffic and everything. And we know aviation is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a drive in places like Ireland and in the UK to add more runways and grow airports and actually encourage more flying. I think that's only going to keep happening. And I think if we're going to use taxpayers' money to bail out these kind of industries, I mean, I do believe we need a just transition out of all dirty industries. So we can't just end aviation overnight, and we can't just end coal and fossil fuel burning overnight, but we need to transition these dirty industries into cleaner industries. But I think if we're going to bail out something like an aviation company, that it has to come attached to plans on behalf of that company to reduce emissions and to become more sustainable. So I think there's an opportunity to link bailout money to sustainability.
Okay. Okay, and just another question, maybe Dierk, this might be more directed at you in terms of shortages for components in the supply chain. That clearly there's been issues around supply in various different components. Is that something that's an issue for solar and wind at the moment?
Actually, we thought it would be when the crisis was really in China. And because most of the components, at least in solar and also in wind, a lot of the components come from China. And with our two very big construction sites in Spain, 500 megawatts to power solar plants, which we're currently building, we thought there is interruptions in the supply chain. That didn't happen. So we received constantly supplies from China, even in the biggest times of crisis from China. So therefore, it didn't materialize. We haven't seen these real shortages in the supply chain. Our bigger fear currently is here in Europe that we can't perform the construction works as we want to due to the restrictions in working procedures. So keeping distances between two workers, and if you have manual work and you have to keep 2 meters distance, it's very hard to work together. So therefore, that is really it's putting pressure on the efficiency in the on the construction works on site. But we haven't really realized shortages in the supply chain from China.
Okay, interesting. And Cara, just sticking domestically in Ireland in relation to government formation, do you think with the Greens in coalition that you'd be more optimistic in terms of achieving 7% reduction targets?
Yeah, the 7% thing is really interesting for those people who aren't from Ireland. Last year, the United Nations wrote a report trying to figure out what would be the emissions reduction level necessary to stay below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees of warming. And they said on average, every country in the world would need to reduce their emissions by 8% a year on average across all the countries. So you could even argue that developed countries should have to do more than that, and less developed countries maybe could get away with doing a little less if they didn't have the money. So in Ireland, the civil society last year during the general election was calling on 8% reduction in emissions annually. And all parties, not just the Green Party, but every party in the general election signed on that they would aspire to this target. And unfortunately, then it got kind of dropped by all parties, except now with the Green Party still in negotiations for government, they've put this back on the table with a proposal for a 7% reduction. So this target is just in line with science. It's what the science says is necessary to achieve our climate targets under the Paris Agreement. And it's unfortunate that it's been left up to the Green Party to sort of figure out how to do it, when in fact every party should be trying to figure out how to do it. But it's great that it's on the table, for one thing, that it's actually a live issue right now. It is hugely ambitious. To give you a context of this, I mean, the coronavirus looks like we're going to be reducing emissions globally by 5%. This year as a result of the sacrifices we've all made in the coronavirus, but those have been huge sacrifices with huge economic implications. So it's not really an effective way of reducing emissions at all. So if that's what it takes for 5%, you can imagine what it might take for 7%. However, that being said, there's been some really good analysis coming out of the Energy Research Division in UCC to show that this would be possible, particularly in the energy sector, but in agriculture, it's really unclear how they would do their part to achieve this 7% target. But Stop Climate Chaos is running a live Zoom at 5 p.m. today with 3 experts to talk about this exact issue and whether or not 7% is possible.
Okay, that's encouraging. And just wondering about the 5%. Is that like for 2 months, or is that for a longer period? The 2 months of shutdown, or is it for a longer period?
That's been globally the estimate for the impact of the coronavirus on our annual emissions. So emissions the last couple of years globally have actually been increasing slightly. They had started to drop, but then in the last couple of years, they've started to kind of increase a little bit again. So this pandemic is resulting in a 5% reduction, they think, as a result of the shutdown in manufacturing and various other sectors over the past couple of months.
But wouldn't it not be a good idea to just, let's say, take as a thesis that we freeze those 5% for the time being, but we find altogether more clever ways of achieving it? I mean, for sure, we can't shut down the whole industry. I mean, if we stay home forever, we have other problems. So therefore, that can't be the solution, how we did it now in COVID-19. But it shows at the same time what is possible. So therefore, there are two views, and just setting the target and say, let's maintain the 5%, let's try to keep that. But what are now the most or the cleverest way really to achieve that without, let's say, really destroying the economy? And this is something we should talk about. And I'm pretty sure that probably we won't have the answers, let's say, like this in a day, but there will be answers. And to work on that, that would be very good. And that is also something the European Commission and other bigger organizations can really focus on. But you hear very little about that currently. That is a pity.
Yeah. And Dierk, maybe just a final question, as for both of you, but starting with Dierk. When you apply for planning permission for, let's say, a wind farm or for a solar park, and you operate across 10 European countries, I presume there's differences between different countries in terms of planning code, planning regulations, people objecting. Do you think that, you know, as we move forward, that some of those regulations may become maybe a bit more deregulated firstly, but more importantly that that companies in the wind and solar areas will look to sort of bring people along more and encourage them more, and that now is a unique time to be able to do that because people are experiencing for the first time, you know, clean air and clear skies?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue, and we have to separately discuss wind and solar. I mean, we are predominantly a solar company, and one reason for that is because permitting is much easier. I mean, in wind, it's really difficult because wind, and that is something which is hard to argue, you have an impact for the society. I mean, if you have poles 150-meter high in front of your house door, and then 20 or 30 of that is an issue for people. Whereas a solar plant is less of an issue. So therefore, the whole impact is different. So therefore, permitting in solar is much easier than in wind. There are differences country by country. Yes, we have to slow down regulations, although the regulations themselves are probably not hindering it too much. It's more the, let's say, the complaints of minorities, which can stop a project for years. And even if it is one farmer or whoever who complains, so then we can have a stop of the whole project. So that has probably to be overcome in order to reach our ambitious targets. And that is also in all the European countries, it is something on the agenda. At the same time, also being much more expedient on the regulatory affairs. If I, for instance, look at Ireland, I mean, the solar tariff was due already 3 years ago. That was the first time when we really dealt with Ireland. We are still waiting for it. So therefore, this is just too long lead times for those markets. And it's not rocket science, really, to put that into place, because you have dozens of European countries who have already done something on that. So therefore, that should be much more expedient from that point of view. Yes, you can always do better on that.
Okay. And Cara, maybe if I could give you the final word, then we'll move over to Q&A.
Yeah, just to follow on from that, here in Ireland, the public support for things like farms and solar and everything is quite high. I mean, there's a like Dierk said, there's a small minority of people that seem to be able to be very loud and vocal about their opposition, but actually Interaction Survey Company has polled people in Ireland and specifically in rural Ireland, and found that in fact people are very open to this, that they've made the link between the need for more renewable energy and having a wind turbine in their backyard, and the regulations around wind here have strengthened a lot more, so that there is much more community engagement and community buy-in, and tougher restrictions on the height of wind turbines and proximity to houses, which the Wind Association actually supports. So that's good. And Dierk is right, where the obstacles are on renewable energy in Ireland is on the regulation side, and very simple policy changes that need to be made specifically in solar to really get that industry to grow. And unfortunately, that is down to a complete lack of resources within the government departments to progress these issues. And I don't see that getting any better now as a result of the pandemic. So there's big concerns that all of these policies are going to stall even longer, and we're going to fall further behind, not only in solar, but in offshore wind, which in Ireland we're way behind. But that's the Irish context. I was recently in Mexico, and going there, I feel like, you know, they're a million miles behind these developed countries like Ireland and other parts of Europe, and there's probably still a long way to go in those areas, just in general, in growing the renewable energy sector.
Okay, super. Thank you, Cara. Okay, what I'd like to do now is to move to Q&A. We do have some questions written in, but if we could just, if you wish to ask a question in the first instance, if you could click on participants, please, and then raise hand if there's any questions, Aldrino.
I will. Yes, we have a first question from Alexander Ferguson. Alexander, you should be able to ask your question now. If you unmute yourself, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. I see my name.
Yes.
Yeah. A couple of questions. First one, first of all, thank you very much for organising this, Bill, and Dierk and Cara, thank you very much for joining. It's very interesting to hear your thoughts on these topics. My first question was really the comment that in contrast to the 08-09 crisis, the recovery from this SARS-2 crisis, and I call it SARS-2 for obvious reasons because it emphasizes the point that we've had 18 years to think about this one, and which leads to a separate point, Cara, about how long we've been talking about environmental issues, and the idea that, you know, no one could possibly have seen this coming. Well, we did. We did nothing about it, exactly the same as occurring with environmental issues. There were many people in the 08-09 crisis who talked about using the opportunity to invest in infrastructure, as you've highlighted already. But with this crisis, and a distinction to the last one, is that the policy responses are likely to include enormous fiscal stimulus, and that is likely to be funded by monetary finance, or as I like to call it, Mugabenomics. It's not a good idea, but it seems that this is where we are in the recovery from this process, and very serious people are taking this idea of monetary finance very seriously. As a result, if done properly, I don't necessarily subscribe to this view, but if done properly, it represents a once-in-a-century opportunity to make that paradigm shift to a lower carbon economy. Do any of you see any real meaningful effort by any administration anywhere in the developed world to consider these very serious environmental factors as part of their fiscal stimulus packages that they're considering at the moment? Dierk, I know you've already said that, you know, the lending stimulus packages are actually counterproductive for companies like yours, which is incredibly depressing to hear. And if you do see those environmental factors being included in such fiscal plans, which countries are most proactive in this regard?
I mean, if I could start, at least from a German perspective, there's a clear link to, let's say, future money being invested post-corona in order to stabilize the economy again, that this should be linked to, let's say, a greener world. However, I have to say this is these are just words currently. So we haven't seen any concrete measures. It was clearly stated by our Chancellor that this link should be given, but it remains now to be seen whether that is really is put into reality. I think we have the same objective on the EU level. Ms. von der Leyen was talking about it. It's part of her Green Deal, but still we are missing really the concrete measures. So therefore, I'm not pessimistic that we can't get there, but I think there's a long way to go once we see that coming into reality.
Yeah.
That is,
just to come in there, I mean, I haven't been looking at the whole world, and I think it's probably too early to tell, given that a lot of countries are still in lockdown mode. But in Ireland, I think this is only on the table at the moment because we happen to be negotiating a government at the same time, and the Green Party happens to be the main party that the two bigger parties are negotiating with. So it is on the table, and I think probably the most interesting development this week in Ireland has been that prior to the pandemic and to the general elections, both of our main parties were supportive of the idea of building new big liquid natural gas terminals to import fracked gas or gas in general, but largely from fracking from the United States into Ireland and then on to Europe. And this was supported by Europe as a way of improving their gas supplies. And now this week, both those main parties have come back to the Green Party saying they will oppose the construction of these LNG terminals now that they acknowledge that we don't need this gas. We've banned fracking on the island of Ireland in the Republic, so it makes sense that we wouldn't accept frack gas from the United States. So that's been a game changer, but perhaps it's been driven by the economics anyway, since I would expect that frack gas from the US will plummet in terms of profits and everything now that the oil prices have dropped. So there may be no incentive to really accept gas from the United States any longer either. So it's just an anecdotal issue that I've been following that's related to your comment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I hear there is that there's rhetoric, but no real implementation, which is alarming because these things need to be discussed right now in order to be put in place as part of these programs. This money is being printed as we speak, and you know, if the groundwork's not being done to implement those policies effectively, then it's not going to happen.
Absolutely, I fully agree. So therefore, what I mentioned earlier, I think we have to put this topic up and said COVID-19, yes, it's an important issue, probably the most important issue for all countries. However, it's not the only one. And politicians look at it like this is, in absolute terms, the only thing we have to care about, and it's not. There are other things which we also have to combine with, and so therefore this voice has to be raised.
I mean, I agree. I think the myopia of politicians thinking that these are separate issues is not. I mean, this is part of the solution to the economic malaise caused by the prevarication and lethargy in responding to SARS-1. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, and it does alarm me. Just one final question, if I may. Do you see any terminology like the use of the words Green New Deal as having any political connotation to it? And I'm specifically thinking about, you know, the run of 2019, the Democratic Party in the United States, obviously being a major emitter in the United States. I mean, do you see that potential political connotation, if you believe there is one, as torpedoing that inclusion of a Green New Deal type issue in any of the sort of fiscal stimulus packages?
Cara, would you go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that the Green New Deal in the United States very much came out of sort of the Democratic parties. And so it's considered a left-right divide. And I think they're going to have a very hard time implementing any kind of sustainability or Green New Deal in a post-COVID recovery. So I'm very worried about what's happening in the US right now. But in Europe, it's been different, where the Green New Deal concept seems to have been taken up in a more or a less partisan way, and isn't considered necessarily a political football. So I'm more optimistic here on this side of the pond, so to speak. But to pick up on your comment there about the silo thinking of the COVID-19 response, I have found that's the biggest issue with environmental problems in general and how politicians deal with them. And a perfect example of that to me is that we see the climate crisis in isolation from all other environmental issues. So we've made mistakes regarding air pollution and diesel vehicles, and reducing taxes on diesel vehicles because it turns out they're devastating for air quality. And we're starting to see the same thing happen, particularly here in Ireland with biodiversity. We have a biodiversity crisis at the same time. We've lost 25% of the world's global insect population since 1990. And we are trying to afforest vast areas of Europe and Ireland using monocultures, which have a negative impact on biodiversity. So while we try and solve one problem like the climate crisis, we often exacerbate another problem like the biodiversity crisis. And I think your example of how we're looking at SARS-2, as you put it, is another example of how our politicians think of things in silos and not holistically.
Yeah. I would also fully agree that, at least from our perspective, continental Europe, the frame or phrase, the new Green Deal, seems to be more, let's say, a problem in the Anglo-Saxon world, rather here than in continental Europe. So I at least haven't heard about that in that context. Second, also to your point, Cara and Alexander, I think what we need currently is really brave politicians, not the ones who do the usual stuff, the easy ones. So really brave ones. And I heard a comment from, let's say, a veteran in German politics, who is now the president of the parliament, the former finance minister. And he said I thought, at least when I read that first, I said, wow. He said, saving lives is not everything in the current context. And he's absolutely right. I mean, it's an important issue, but it's not everything. And I think if you think about that, how a lot of politicians act currently, it's just about saving lives. But this is not sufficient. It is important, but not sufficient.
Yeah, brave politicians and monetary finance combined don't always lead to a good outcome, unless they're a benevolent dictator, which I'm used to in Singapore.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you very much, Alex. Next question is from Joe Motley. Joe, you should be able to ask a question now if you unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks to both of the presenters for some very interesting insights, and thanks, Bill, for organizing it. I have two possibly related questions for Dierk. First of all, what do you anticipate, the recent collapse in the crude oil price, what do you anticipate the impact of that will be on the competitive position of green energy generation? And secondly, is there any indication of recent prices in the market for solar and wind power assets? I guess there aren't many transactions taking place right now, but is there any indication of how indicative prices for assets and how they might have moved in recent times as a result of the economic crisis and the fall in oil prices?
Yeah, thanks, Joe, for putting those questions. First of all, on the yes, we have seen energy prices coming down by 20–30% over the last weeks. And this definitely had a short-term impact on the wholesale prices, also on the power market. We think, at least, and that's a little bit still of a crystal ball, but we think at least that in line with most market participants, that we are back to normal in 2 to 3 years. Actually, if it would come like that, it doesn't impact too much any investments, because we are calculating our investments on a 25-year horizon. So therefore, the first 2 years don't have a too big impact. So if it would last much longer, it would definitely impact then also the calculation of our IRR expectations. So therefore, but from current perspective, we see that there is a big enough demand for green energy, probably, as we talked about, even higher demand post-corona. And so that should counterbalance these price effects in the markets. On the investments or opportunities in the markets, have we seen, let's say, deals priced at a different level to the times before Corona? No, not yet. Many people are talking about this, that there should be, let's say, that prices should come down, but we still see there is so much liquidity in the market, and focused still on that sector, that we haven't seen that price expectations have come down. That might be an effect. We might see the one or the other portfolio be more under pressure in the months to come, but not yet realized in the market.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. The next question is by Bernard. Bernard, you can ask your question now if you unmute yourself. All right, Bernard, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, very, very good. This is a question for Cara, because it's really about the Irish situation specifically on
Hello? I think we
Bernard's been muted.
Give me 1 second.
I've unmuted myself again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is for Cara, because it's specifically about Ireland, but we have this 7% target, and yet talking again, referring back to another form of what seems to be the lack of joined up thinking. Our population is growing at a very fast rate, and population is what causes carbon. Is this off the agenda totally to discuss the significance of the free movement of people in Europe, EU, and its effect on Ireland? Does that enter at all into anything you see strategically discussed about any realistic prospect for Ireland meeting its carbon targets? I mean, you hear politicians talking on the one hand about carbon targets, this, that, and the other, and we must do this, that. On the other hand, on another agenda, they'll be saying we have to realize that by 2030, our population will be, 2050, our population will be 20%, 30% higher. Seems totally incongruous to me.
Yeah, it's a good point. Population is brought up at almost every talk I give, you know, in a global context. And in this kind of, there's always somebody who thinks that the solution to climate change is somehow, you know, controlling birth rates and one-child policies and everything. And so generally the issue is not necessarily the number of people. It's the countries like Ireland, like the United States, like Australia, where our lifestyles are very high carbon. So, you know, a person in Ireland emits about 13 tons of carbon per person versus a person in Ethiopia, which uses about 2 tons of carbon per person. So we all, to kind of achieve the Paris target agreements, we all need to get our carbon footprints around 4 to 6 tons per person. So that's the issue. It's about lifestyle really more than about the individual people. But to answer your question about the population growth of Ireland, which is projected to grow considerably, it hasn't really been factored into the emissions targets. So the climate action plan that we have that projects this 2% emissions reductions per year is ignoring the fact that there will be a growing population coming into Ireland, and they don't seem too concerned about that. So that is a worry, and it could negate all the efforts to reduce emissions if they don't factor that in.
Yeah, that's more than a worry. It's an astounding worry, isn't it, really? Because we're supposed to be strategically thinking here. It's supposed to be joined up. And yet that's the caliber of strategic planning and thought and discussion that's going on specifically in Ireland. But I would have to disagree with you about even in the global context, the significance of population growth. Because the way you've said it is not the way it's been happening. The way it's been happening is where the populations have been growing very fast, and where they're given the opportunity, which they should, and of course have to catch up GDP per capita with the rest of us, that's where the carbon is coming from, most at the margin. So, you know, it's very hard to argue, to avoid the reality that this is about, there is a very significant aspect of population in this, both globally and within any nation that wants to consider a realistic response to realistically to talk joined up thinking strategically about carbon reduction.
It's not a straightforward answer. I mean, the reason China's emissions are the highest in the world is because countries like ours buy a lot of products from China. It's not because the Chinese people have such high carbon emitting lifestyles. So we drive that, and conversely, we are driving, you know, here in Ireland, we've been marketing infant formula to the Chinese quite intensively, trying to drive a market there that didn't exist previously. So actually trying to give them the lifestyle we have, and driving their own per capita carbon emissions higher. So it is, and I think we saw this in India during the Obama administration, that there was a big push for the US and for China to try and facilitate development in countries like India in a renewable way, to try and help them invest in solar so that they could grow their economies without having to create more coal-fired power plants and things like that. So I think it is possible. And regarding population, I mean, if we are looking at some way of trying to curb growth rates in developing countries, the two most effective ways have been found to be the education of women and the control of their fertility. So, I mean, I think if you actually are going down that pathway, those are the things you should be investing in.
I think, yes. I mean, you could talk all day about, you know, the cause and effect between China's growth, Eurasia's growth, and it being because of our consumption or theirs. But they're growing their economies so that they can consume more. It's not so that we can. You know, that's the way economies and trade works. So, quite honestly, it does come back in a very important way to population.
Well, a lot of people would say actually it comes down to a discussion about consumption and then whether or not we need to be talking about degrowth.
We need to talk about different ways to consume, for sure, Cara, for sure. But this whole agenda that keeps population out of itself just because it's the thing to do is suspect. It's suspect both nationally in Ireland and globally as a key part of a realistic discussion about what's a huge issue, whether we destroy the planet or not.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge issue, but I don't think, I mean, if you look at China, they implemented a one-child policy that they've now realized had really critical social problems. Sorry, I have a visitor, and that, you know, that's another issue we have to factor in is the social implications of looking at population.
Oh, totally, yeah. No, it's just worth discussing that to bring it onto the table, because it's the last thing you'll ever see on the table in these discussions.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think we've been on just under an hour. Unless there's one really quick question, I'm going to wrap up now.
Yeah, we have one last question, and it's from Joe. Joe, you can ask your question now, please.
Can you hear me?
Joe, can you?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Anyway, okay, it was quick. It may not be that quick. It's three things. One, to Dierk, in Germany, given the particularly the current economic environment, is there pressure from German industrialists on the political setup to restrict or to roll back on policies?
Sorry, Joe, I didn't get that.
Okay, I'm saying in Germany.
It was a little bit broken.
In Germany at present, given the nature of the decline, given this pandemic, the decline there, is there pressure from business interests to say to their politicians, let us hold off on climate emission targets till we get the economy back up and running?
You mean that we put, let's say, more pressure on the climate emission targets, or that we lower them or bring them up?
You forget them. Just get the economy back.
No, that is not, to be honest, that's not yes, it might be, let's say, in minorities who talk about that, but the vast majority, at least from the German industry, still follows the rule. I mean, there's only one way ahead of us, and that includes, let's say, a greener world. I haven't heard any serious discussion about falling back into the politics of the 60s or the 70s. I think that's not being discussed currently, and also not amongst the politicians.
Okay, I know Dierk has got another engagement, so we've got time for just one final question, Joe.
Okay, if you've got another game, leave it. Okay, Grant, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Yeah, we'll maybe follow up later on. So look, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to thank you for your questions. We obviously have some people calling in from Asia, so it's almost 10 o'clock at night in Hong Kong and Singapore right now. I'd like to thank Dierk, and I'd like to thank Cara for a really super and wide-ranging discussion. I'd also just point out that Encavis, I sent through a fact book to everyone on the reminder invite, so if anyone hasn't got that fact book, please contact us, and we'd be delighted to send it out to you. Encavis have got an excellent IR program, so that they're very much available and visible in terms of releases and updates on their business. So look, this is a debate that clearly is going to continue. So Cara and Dierk, I'd love to have you back again, because no doubt there's going to be more updates on this as we move forward over the coming months. So in the meantime, I'd like to wish everyone all the best, and keep safe, and we look forward to catching up with you again on the next Think Tank. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.